Today, India is a sovereign democratic republic with its own parliament, constitution, and head of state. In this scenario, that independence never arrives, and the biggest decisions about the subcontinent would still be shaped in London rather than fully in New Delhi. Fact 1. India would most likely not be a fully sovereign republic. It would probably function either as a crown colony with limited self-government or as a dominion where the British monarch remained head of state and Westminster kept ultimate constitutional authority. That means Indian elections might still exist, but the final legal framework would not rest entirely in Indian hands. The most important difference would be this: India's government today answers to its own constitution, while in this alternate path, imperial constitutional limits would still sit above it. Fact 2. English would be even more dominant than it is now in administration, courts, universities, and elite employment. India already uses English for many official purposes, and its present parliamentary system was heavily shaped by British models. Under continued British control, that influence would likely be deeper, not lighter. The practical advantage would be easier integration with British and global institutions. The negative side is that Hindi and many regional languages would probably receive weaker state support at the highest levels of power, making language inequality even sharper. Fact 3. The map of South Asia would probably look completely different. If Britain had remained in control, the exact partition that created India and Pakistan might never have happened in the same way, and Bangladesh might not have emerged as a separate state when it did. That could mean fewer hard borders inside the old Raj, but it would not automatically mean peace. Communal tensions that helped drive partition would still exist, and under continued imperial rule they might be frozen, suppressed, or militarized rather than truly resolved. Fact 4. Economically, the outcome would likely be mixed. On the positive side, India might be even more tightly connected to British finance, shipping, ports, railways, and legal commercial networks. Colonial rule did build major transport systems that tied the subcontinent together, but historically, those systems were not created mainly for Indian prosperity. They were also designed to serve imperial extraction and trade. So a British-controlled India today might be more globally connected in some sectors, while still carrying deeper structural inequality, because profits and priorities would remain shaped by imperial interests. Fact 5. India's legal and administrative system would probably look more visibly imperial. The courts and bureaucracy already carry strong British-era foundations through common law, codified procedure, and civil service traditions. Under continued British rule, those institutions would likely be even more centralised, formal, and insulated from mass democratic pressure. The benefit could be continuity, administrative discipline, and strong commercial predictability. The cost would be political distance. Ordinary Indians might still feel that the system was efficient in form, but not fully theirs in legitimacy, identity, or ultimate accountability. Fact 6. India's foreign policy would not be fully independent. Instead of acting as a major global player balancing relationships with powers like the United States, China, and Russia, India would likely follow strategic priorities set in London. That could mean stronger alignment with British allies and NATO-style frameworks. The benefit would be consistent diplomatic backing and military coordination. The downside is obvious. India would not have full control over its own global stance, and its unique regional interests might sometimes be overridden by broader British geopolitical goals. Fact 7. The Indian economy might be more integrated into a British-centred trade system. Tariffs, exports, and industrial priorities could be shaped to complement British economic needs rather than purely domestic ones. This might boost sectors like finance, shipping, and services linked to global markets. However, local industries could face limitations if they compete with British companies. Over time, India might become highly efficient in certain global roles, but less diversified, with some regions benefiting greatly while others remain economically dependent and underdeveloped. Fact 8. Cultural identity would likely be more hybrid, but also more contested. British cultural influence, education systems, media norms, architecture, and even social etiquette would remain deeply embedded. Urban elites might feel closely aligned with British culture, possibly even more than today. At the same time, this could intensify debates about national identity, heritage, and cultural preservation. traditional practices and regional identities might either adapt or resist more strongly, creating a society where cultural blending exists alongside ongoing tension about authenticity and historical continuity. Fact 9. India's military would probably be structured as part of a broader British imperial defence system. Indian soldiers might still serve globally under British command, similar to historical patterns during both World Wars. This could provide advanced training, equipment, and international experience. However, ultimate command decisions might not rest with Indian leadership. That creates a trade-off: strong military capability and global reach, but reduced sovereignty over when, where, and why forces are deployed, especially in conflicts not directly tied to India's own security. Fact 10. Democratic development would likely be slower or more limited in scope. While local elections and representative institutions might exist, ultimate authority could remain with British-appointed officials or constitutional limits set by the UK. This might produce administrative stability and gradual reforms, but it would also restrict mass political participation and grassroots power. Over time, this could lead to periodic unrest or reform movements demanding fuller self-rule, meaning political tension would remain a constant feature rather than a resolved chapter of history. Fact 11. Urban development in India might be more concentrated in a few major imperial cities rather than broadly distributed. Cities like Mumbai, Kolkata, and Delhi could become even larger administrative and financial hubs tied closely to British global networks. Infrastructure in these areas might be highly advanced, reflecting imperial priorities. However, smaller cities and rural regions could lag behind, receiving less investment. This would likely widen regional inequality, creating a country where opportunity is heavily concentrated in select urban centres rather than evenly spread. Fact 12. India's education system would likely be even more aligned with British curricula and academic standards. Universities might follow British models more strictly, with greater emphasis on disciplines valued by imperial administration such as law, governance, and commerce. This could improve global recognition of degrees and ease mobility into international careers. On the other hand, local knowledge systems, regional histories, and indigenous perspectives might receive less emphasis, potentially narrowing the intellectual diversity of education and shaping generations to think within externally defined frameworks. Fact 13. Industrial development might follow a more controlled path. Instead of rapid, independent industrialization driven by national policy, India's industries could evolve in ways that complement British economic interests. Some sectors, like textiles, raw materials, and services, might expand efficiently within global supply chains. However, heavy industries or strategic sectors might be limited if they compete with British production. This could result in a stable but constrained industrial base, where growth exists but full economic independence and innovation capacity are somewhat restricted. Fact 14. Social hierarchy could remain more rigid in certain ways. British colonial systems often reinforced existing social structures while introducing new administrative elites. Under continued rule, a class of English-educated professionals might dominate government, law, and business even more strongly than today. This could create clear divisions between those integrated into imperial systems and those outside them. While some individuals would gain significant upward mobility, broader social equality might progress more slowly, leaving structural inequalities more deeply embedded across generations. Fact 15. India's global identity would be fundamentally different. Instead of being seen as a rising independent power, it might be viewed as a key component of a larger British-led system. This could reduce its individual visibility on the world stage while increasing its importance within imperial networks. Indian culture, economy, and influence would still be significant, but often framed through a British lens. The trade-off would be clear: strong association with a global power, but less recognition as a fully independent voice shaping its own destiny. Fact 16. India's taxation system would likely be structured around imperial priorities rather than purely domestic needs. Revenue collection could focus heavily on maintaining administrative control, infrastructure tied to trade, and contributions to broader British state functions. While this might create a disciplined and predictable tax system, it could also mean that a portion of national wealth consistently flows outward rather than being reinvested locally. Over time, this could limit large-scale domestic welfare programs and reduce the government's ability to independently direct economic redistribution. Fact 17. Healthcare development might be uneven but institutionally strong in certain areas. Major cities could have well-funded hospitals influenced by British medical standards, training and research systems. Public health campaigns might be organised efficiently, especially for issues that affect trade or military readiness. However, rural healthcare could remain under-prioritised if it is not seen as strategically essential. This would create a system where high-quality care exists, but access is inconsistent, leaving large parts of the population dependent on limited or delayed medical services. Fact 18. India's technological and scientific progress would likely be shaped by British research priorities. Collaboration with British universities and institutions could accelerate advancements in fields like engineering, medicine, and communications. This might lead to strong integration into global scientific networks. However, independent innovation agendas, especially those focused on uniquely Indian challenges, might receive less emphasis. As a result, India could become highly capable in applied science within global systems, but less autonomous in setting its own long-term research direction. Fact 19. Agricultural policy might remain closely tied to export-oriented production. Crops that are valuable in international markets, such as tea, cotton, and spices, could receive priority support, infrastructure, and investment. This could boost export revenue and strengthen global trade links. However, it might also reduce focus on local food security and diversified farming. Farmers could become more vulnerable to global price fluctuations, and rural economies might depend heavily on external demand rather than stable domestic consumption patterns. Fact 20. National identity and political movements would likely remain active and evolving rather than settled. Even after decades of continued British rule, demands for greater autonomy or full independence would probably persist across different regions and social groups. These movements might take political, legal, or even protest-based forms, depending on how much power is devolved locally. This means that instead of a clear historical endpoint like independence in 1947, India's political landscape would be defined by ongoing negotiation between imperial authority and local aspirations. Fact 21. India's media landscape would likely be more regulated under imperial oversight. While newspapers, television, and digital platforms might still operate, there could be stricter controls on content that challenges British authority or questions the structure of governance. This might create a more stable and less polarised media environment on the surface. However, it would also limit press freedom and investigative journalism. Over time, public discourse could become more cautious, with certain topics avoided entirely or discussed only within boundaries set by higher authorities. Fact 22. Infrastructure development might be highly strategic but uneven. Railways, ports, and highways would likely continue expanding, especially in regions critical for trade, military movement, and economic output. India could have one of the most efficient logistics networks in the world in areas prioritised by imperial planners. However, regions considered less economically or strategically important might receive minimal investment. This would create a country where connectivity is excellent in some corridors, but gaps remain in others, reinforcing regional disparities. Fact 23. India's currency and financial system might be closely tied to the British pound or a shared monetary framework. This could provide stability, reduce exchange rate volatility, and make international trade with British-aligned economies easier. Financial institutions might follow British regulatory models, increasing investor confidence. On the other hand, India would have limited control over its own monetary policy. Decisions about interest rates, inflation control, and currency valuation could prioritise broader imperial economic stability rather than India's specific domestic needs. Fact 24. Migration patterns would likely be very different. There could be easier movement between India and the United Kingdom, especially for education, work, and administration. A larger number of Indians might live and work in Britain as part of an integrated imperial system. This could create strong transnational communities and cultural exchange. However, it might also lead to brain drain, where highly skilled individuals leave India for better opportunities abroad, slowing domestic development in critical sectors like science, medicine, and engineering. Fact 25. Environmental policy might be shaped by economic priorities rather than local sustainability concerns. Natural resources such as forests, minerals, and water systems could be managed primarily for industrial and export purposes. While this might accelerate economic output, it could also lead to overexploitation and environmental degradation in certain regions. Conservation efforts might exist, especially where resources are strategically valuable, but local ecological balance and community needs might not always be the primary focus in long-term planning decisions. Fact 26. India's digital and technological sovereignty would likely be limited. Major decisions about data regulation, cybersecurity frameworks, and digital infrastructure could be influenced or directly controlled by British institutions. This might ensure strong alignment with global standards and potentially higher levels of security coordination. However, it would also mean India could not fully control its own digital policies. Issues like data privacy, surveillance, and tech industry regulation might reflect imperial priorities rather than the specific needs and values of India's population. Fact 27. The legal concept of citizenship might be fundamentally different. Instead of a purely Indian national identity, people could hold a form of imperial citizenship tied to the United Kingdom. This might allow broader rights of movement and work across British-controlled territories. At the same time, it could blur national identity and create layered loyalties. Individuals might identify both as Indian and as subjects of a larger imperial system, which could strengthen global integration but weaken the sense of a unified, independent national identity. Fact 28. India's space and defence innovation programs might develop under joint British oversight. Large-scale projects like satellite systems, defence technology, and research initiatives could benefit from shared funding and expertise. This might accelerate certain technological capabilities. However, strategic autonomy would be reduced. India might not independently decide the direction or application of its most advanced technologies, especially in areas with military implications, leading to a balance between technological progress and limited strategic control. Fact 29. Religious and social policies could remain sensitive and tightly managed. British authorities historically attempted to balance different communities to maintain stability. Under continued rule, policies might focus on preventing conflict rather than encouraging deep social reform. This could reduce large-scale unrest in the short term, but might also delay meaningful progress on complex social issues. Instead of organic, locally driven solutions, many decisions would be shaped by administrative caution and the goal of maintaining order above all else. Fact 30. India's long-term economic trajectory might be stable but less independent. Growth could be steady due to integration with established global systems, legal predictability, and institutional continuity. However, major strategic decisions, such as industrial policy, trade alliances, and economic reforms, might not be fully controlled domestically. This could limit the country's ability to rapidly pivot or pursue bold, independent economic strategies. Over time, India might become prosperous in certain sectors, while still structurally dependent on external decision-making centres. Fact 31. Over decades, pressure for independence would likely intensify rather than disappear. Even with reforms, shared governance, and economic integration, the desire for full self-determination would persist across generations. Movements could become more organised, more political, or more widespread, especially as education and awareness grow. This means that continued British control would not freeze history. It would extend the struggle. Instead of a clear endpoint, India's modern story would be defined by an ongoing question: when, not if, full independence finally arrives. History delayed, not erased. So when does independence finally arrive? You decide.